Washington, D.C., home of the federal government, featuring Congress, our national legislature, the President of the United States, and the U.S. Supreme Court. Hartford, Connecticut, home to Connecticut's state government, one of 50 state governments, featuring the Connecticut State Legislature, the Governor of Connecticut, the Connecticut State Supreme Court. Excuse me, isn't all of this a bit repetitive?
Actually, it's complementary. For in America, government operates on two main levels, national and state, which share and divide powers. It is a system known as federalism, and it lies at the heart of United States government.
Give me liberty, or give me death.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Ask not what your country can do for you.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America.
What is federalism?
I don't know.
I don't remember federalism.
Federalism? That I don't know.
Oh shoot, federalism. Gee, I should have paid attention in my economics class.
When we say federalism, we're talking about a system of government. You can think of federalism as a way to find national solutions to national problems and local solutions to local problems. Remember, don't confuse federal with federalism. Federal is just another word for national. So when we talk about the federal government, we mean the national U.S. government.
I really think of federalism as the essence of democracy. You've got to remember that when this country began, it began as a very independent-minded grassroots movement. And yet, as the country grew, there was no question that there had to be some form of centralized government.
1787, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The members of the Constitutional Convention are about to reinvent the American government. During the chaotic years following the Revolutionary War, people have resisted forming a centralized government, afraid that it will trample on their hard-won liberties. Instead, they keep their powers closer to home at the state level.
Under an agreement called the Articles of Confederation, each state has its own laws, its own currency, even its own militia.
With no ability to tax citizens directly or regulate commerce, the U.S. Congress is ineffective.
The economy is on the brink of collapse.
Still worse, foreign countries don't take the fledgling nation seriously. They see no union, but rather 13 states as likely to fight each other as they are a common enemy. In Philadelphia, the greatest minds in America ponder how to maintain local control while strengthening the nation as a whole. Their answer? The United States Constitution.
The blueprint for our government, the U.S. Constitution, leaves a lot of authority in the hands of the states, the key to protecting citizens from an abusive central authority. But it delegates other powers to the federal government. Our system of government, known as federalism, is born.
One of the greatest advantages of a federal system is that public policies can be crafted for the local conditions, economic, social, cultural, instead of having uniform policies across the entire nation.
In federalism, national and state governments each have their own spheres of power, but occasionally those spheres overlap.
Often the two levels work well together, but sometimes they conflict, and then things can get messy.
Sometimes it's good, and sometimes, quite candidly, it can be very frustrating.
Throughout the course of American history, the balance of power between the national and state governments has been in flux. The roots of this fluidity can be found in the U.S. Constitution itself.
Article 1, Section 8 says that only Congress can regulate commerce with foreign nations, declare war, coin money, or impose duties and collect taxes. So stuff like our relationships with other countries, our national defense, And our economic policies are the sole province of the federal government. Makes sense. It'd be confusing and expensive if each of the states tried to do all of that themselves. Now you're probably thinking, well, that still leaves the states with the power to make laws governing everything else, right? Wrong. You see, there's also this little clause that says Congress has the right to make any laws necessary and proper to help it carry out its powers. Over the years, those powers have been stretched to cover so many things that Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 is sometimes known as the Elastic Clause. So can the Elastic Clause shoot down state rights? Not if the 10th Amendment can help it. It says that any powers not given to the federal government and not forbidden by the Constitution are reserved to the states or the people. Traditionally, those were things like education and roads.
The 10th Amendment reserving power to the states has largely been overtaken by events. Responsibilities have shifted to the national government. The Supreme Court has interpreted other provisions of the Constitution to give the national government authority to override what had been considered a state responsibility.
Structurally, our federal government and state governments look alike. For one thing, the federal government and each of the 50 state governments have a constitution. But while the U.S. Constitution is brief in general, the state constitutions are often lengthy and specific to a fault.
The original U.S. Constitution is less than 5,000 words long, while one of the state constitutions weighs in at a whopping 174,000 words.
Even though state constitutions reflect the individual concerns of their citizens, they all have one thing in common.
They can't disagree with the United States Constitution. As the highest law of the land, it is the last word on American government.
At both the state and federal levels, laws are made by a legislative branch, carried out by an executive branch, and interpreted and applied by the Judicial Branch. A state legislature makes laws just like the U.S. Congress does. But congressional legislation affects the whole nation, while state laws only affect people in that state.
Like the bottle laws passed in some states to encourage recycling. You don't get anything for turning in a can in Texas, but you get 5 cents for that same can in Massachusetts, and 10 cents in Michigan.
Under federalism, different states have different laws reflecting regional differences.
It's so important for citizens to understand that the nature and quality of their lives are strongly affected by where they live. State laws vary tremendously in response to the preferences and needs and conditions of that particular state. We have states like New Hampshire and Texas with no income tax at all. We have other states like Connecticut with very high levels of taxation and substantial levels of social support for citizens without the means to live a healthy life. The range across states is extraordinary.
Sometimes a law generated in one state is so good that it spreads to the neighboring states.
States are oftentimes called laboratories of democracy. They provide opportunities to test policies before they are scaled up to the national level.
It saves the rest of the country a lot of mistakes and money.
A successful experiment at the state level that carried then to the national level can be seen in welfare reform. Many states, including the state of Wisconsin, tried various forms of workfare for welfare recipients, and many of those ideas were then incorporated in the Welfare Reform Act of 1996.
Each state has its own rules about who can run for office and how each legislature is set up. Usually, a state is divided into small units called districts, from which legislators are elected. Most legislatures have two houses, often called the Senate and the House of Representatives, but the size of the legislature varies widely from state to state. New Hampshire has almost 7 times the number of members in its state legislature as Nevada.
The point is, it's up to each individual state to decide the particular issues that affect its citizens, with one condition: nothing can contradict the United States Constitution.
To be effective, state legislators must stay in touch with the people of their districts. They listen to their concerns so that they can represent their needs in the state capitol.
In the process of creating a law, we sometimes are directly impacting on our constituents, and it can be very fulfilling to see how our constituency may benefit from that law. It can be a very moving experience and a very satisfying one.
The legislature also helps the governor prepare the state budget and confirms or rejects his or her nominations for state appointees. In the rare case that a state official is suspected of criminal misconduct, the legislature can impeach or formally charge and try that official. If found guilty, the official is removed from office.
The chief executive of the United States is the president. The chief executive of a state is the governor.
As the head of the executive branch of a state government, many of a governor's duties are similar to the president's. For instance, a president appoints officials, proposes a federal budget, and is the commander-in-chief of the United States military. Likewise, a governor appoints state officials, prepares a state budget, and commands the state's military, the National Guard. Both presidents and governors propose and approve legislation, and both wield the powerful tool of veto, the authority to reject a bill.
Parallel levels of the legislative branch, parallel levels of the executive branch. I bet it's going to come as a big surprise that under federalism, there are also 2 levels of the judiciary branch: the federal court system, which interprets federal laws, and 50 separate state court systems, which interpret the laws of each individual state.
In both, there are lower courts where cases are first heard. At the federal level, these lower courts are known as district courts, and at the state level, they are called general trial courts. Both systems also include courts of appeal, known as appellate courts. Here, the decision of the lower court can be reviewed.
If the appellate court agrees with the lower court, the decision is upheld. If it does not, the decision is rejected or overturned.
At both the state and federal levels, there is a Supreme Court, which is the last word on a state or federal law.
But what if a state law conflicts with a federal law?
In that case, it's in the hands of the United States Supreme Court, the final stop in the legal system and the only court that can overturn the decision of a state Supreme Court. Still, it is those state courts that do the lion's share of the nation's judicial work.
By placing some control in the hands of the states, federalism makes sure power stays near the people. Nowhere is that more true than in local government.
I'm the chief elected official for the town, and I'm responsible for the daily management of the town government. The great thing about being at the local level is you really deal with the people. The issues that people face in their municipalities affect their daily lives continuously. And so when it is things like, their street being plowed, or someone's power going out, or someone's concerns about the school program, it's very gratifying as an elected official to be able to solve those problems at such a personal level. We have roads that obviously don't begin and end in a particular town, they go through. And so it's very important that there be someone out there that's looking at the road from the beginning of the state's border to the end of the state's border.
That someone, of course, is the state. For though a town may seem independent, it actually gets all of its power from the state government. The laws and constitution of the state even determine how local government will be run. By a county government managed by a county board, or by a town government like Westport, Connecticut's, which has a select board or a board of trustees.
In many New England towns, like tiny Granville, Vermont, the state allows voters to get together once a year at a town meeting to talk about local issues.
We looked very hard at the budget to see where we could cut costs.
It's a chance for neighbors and elected officials to share their proposals about budgets, taxes, and future growth, and then vote on them. But while the town meeting works well in small communities, somehow it just doesn't translate to a major urban area.
To govern a city, voters elect a city council to make their laws and a mayor to be their chief executive.
Andrew Young has been a civil rights leader, a United States congressman, and a delegate to the United Nations. But no job has made him prouder than his tenure as the mayor of Atlanta, Georgia.
For injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
We were having problems when I was elected mayor because we were still a regional city. And we were dependent on the federal government and the federal economy for growth. I helped to conceive of Atlanta as a global city, and we began to relate more to the global economy and to bring in investors from all over the world.
During his time as mayor, Andrew Young aided in Atlanta's economic development, bringing great growth and prosperity to the city. He helped to create over 500,000 jobs for Atlanta residents.
So I always focused on how do we make times good for everybody, and not just for the rich, but the rich and the poor, black, white, brown, red, yellow, what have you. And then helping a metropolitan area of 4 million people have a different conception of themselves and their future. It really is a challenging and exciting job.
Just as Atlanta is a model for other cities, Andrew Young is a model for civic leadership, making him an American original.
Whether you're a big city mayor or a county commissioner in a small town, all local officials grapple with the same core issues: police, schools, and how land is used. They're the big three controlled by state and local governments.
But are these local issues? After all, the federal government takes an interest in law enforcement, education, and land use as well.
Historically, in the past, for instance, education was strictly a local matter. That is, the federal government had nothing to do with it. Local decisions would determine what education was going to be. That served our country very, very well. And then as we got into the 20th century and the end of the 20th century, we said, you know, it isn't enough anymore that we just leave these decisions locally. It's going to be very important for us as a country that a child in Connecticut and a child in Alabama or Mississippi have an equal opportunity to education because it'll determine the strength of our nation.
For our country's first 100 years, most people favored state control over national control.
They thought that states could best protect civil liberties. And what about things like health and social services? Once they were completely provided by state governments, but not anymore.
1932. For 3 years, the nation's economy has been on a downward spiral so profound that the era will come to be known as the Great Depression. Democratic presidential nominee Franklin Delano Roosevelt believes it is time for action. During his first 2 terms as president, Roosevelt's New Deal revolutionized the role of the federal government. For the first time, the national government stepped in to take care of the health and social well-being of its citizens, giving rise to the modern welfare state. The most far-reaching program was Social Security, a system of old-age pensions and disability insurance that created a safety net for all Americans.
So how does the federal government get the states to go along with its programs? One way is by acting like a big boss. The federal government just says, do it, because we say you have to. It's called a mandate, a word that means command. And sometimes it's good to have the boss around.
1957. In Little Rock, Arkansas, 9 black students attempt to enroll at a local all-white high school. Despite a federal mandate calling for school desegregation, Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus is determined to keep the students out. When the governor orders the National Guard to block their entrance, President Dwight D. Eisenhower sends in 1,000 troops to protect the 9 students and desegregate the school.
The resistance to mandates isn't usually so violent, but even in the best of times, states aren't crazy about them.
Not only can they trespass on local authority, they're often costly.
And there's nothing worse than being told you've got to do something you don't want to do and have to pay for the honor on top of it. That's why the federal government also persuades states to go along with its rules using the old carrot and stick approach.
For a carrot, the federal government gives money to a state to carry out services on the condition that the state conforms to national standards.
It's called conditions of aid.
It's been used in federal funding for education, land use, road maintenance, and social welfare, all programs once considered the domain of the states.
Let's face it, the federal government has more money than any of the individual states, so Congress often attaches funding to provide the means for states to reach their goals.
If money is the carrot, then withholding that money is the stick.
Like the 55-mile-per-hour speed limit. At the height of the energy crisis in the 1970s, Congress, for the first time, decided it should tell the states how fast their citizens could drive. Conserve gasoline, said the federal government. Drive 55 or lose your federal funding for highways.
Even after the energy crisis eased up, the federal government left in this condition of aid.
It really teed off some of the rural states. To get the funds, they obeyed the condition technically, but they ignored it in reality. In Montana, the 55-mile-per-hour speed limit stayed on the books, but the fine for speeding was dropped to $5 and was almost never enforced.
In 1987, Congress repealed the speed limit requirement as a condition for receiving highway funds, marking a shift in the balance of power between the states and the federal government. Many in Washington saw that power over such local issues should be returned to the states. The U.S. federal government is marked by an ongoing battle for power between the national and state governments.
It's a desire to get government at every level to work more closely together to serve the common good, and not to be bickering with each other over who's going to control the dollar. But remember what the dollar's for and where the dollar came from.
It all comes back to federalism, the idea of local solutions to local problems and national solutions to national problems.
The big picture and the small details. The United States government operates on many levels, not top-down or bottom-up, but more like a great big mixture of levels. That's the ever-shifting system known as federalism.